Sometimes the person who breaks your heart is the only one who can save your life. The rain slammed against the hospital windows as Emily Carter gripped the side rails of the stretcher, trying to breathe through another wave of pain while fluorescent lights flashed above her one after another like a blur. Her damp blonde hair clung to her cheeks, and her fingers trembled around the tiny silver cross hanging from her neck. "Please," she whispered through shaky breaths. "Please make sure my baby's okay." The paramedic beside her gave a reassuring nod as they rushed her through the crowded emergency entrance of St. Mary's Medical Center in downtown Chicago, just after midnight. Nurses moved quickly around her while thunder echoed outside, shaking the glass doors near the lobby. 32-year-old female, the paramedic called out. 38 weeks pregnant. Severe contractions started 2 hours ago. Blood pressure unstable during transport. Emily closed her eyes for a second, trying to block out the panic building in her chest. This was not how she imagined tonight would happen. She had planned everything carefully for months. The hospital bag by the door. The emergency contacts. The route to the hospital only 12 minutes from her apartment. But life had stopped following her plans a long time ago. Especially after Ethan Brooks disappeared from her life 5 years earlier without a single explanation. Another sharp pain forced a gasp from her lips as the stretcher turned down a hallway. A nurse hurried beside her. "You're doing great, Emily. Just stay calm for me." Calm. She almost laughed hearing that word. Nothing about her life had felt calm since the day the man she loved vanished without warning. The doors to labor and delivery burst open as staff prepared the room. Machines beeped softly while another nurse adjusted the monitor around Emily's stomach. "Where's the attending doctor?" someone asked near the doorway. "On his way," another voice answered quickly. Emily tried focusing on the ceiling tiles, but fear kept creeping into her mind. She was alone. No husband. No family nearby. Just her and the baby she had spent years protecting with. Everything she had left. Then suddenly the room changed. The nurses straightened. The tension shifted. Someone important had entered. Emily noticed it immediately even before she looked up. A deep male voice spoke calmly from near the door. "Give me her vitals." Her entire body froze. No. Her heart skipped so hard it almost hurt. That voice. After 5 years she would have recognized it anywhere. Slowly, Emily turned her head toward the doorway as the man stepped under the bright hospital lights wearing navy blue scrubs beneath a dark coat soaked with rain. Tall. Sharp jawline. Familiar green eyes. Dr. Ethan Brooks. Billionaire medical CEO. Nationally respected surgeon. The man who had once promised he would never leave her. Emily stared at him in complete shock while the color slowly drained from Ethan's face too. For one silent second, neither of them breathed. Then another contraction hit, pulling Emily back into reality as pain crossed her face. Ethan immediately stepped closer, his professional composure snapping into place even though his eyes still looked stunned. "I'm Dr. Brooks," he said quietly, his voice tighter than before. "And I'm going to take care of you tonight." Emily felt tears burn her eyes as disbelief crashed into anger. Out of every hospital in Chicago, out of every doctor in America, the man standing beside her was the one person she had prayed never to see again. But Ethan hadn't looked at her stomach yet. He hadn't seen the name written on the hospital bracelet resting against her wrist. And the moment he did, everything was about to change. Emily could barely hear the storm outside anymore because the sound of Ethan Brooks's voice had drowned out everything else in the room. Her pulse pounded violently in her ears as she stared at the man standing beside her hospital bed, looking older than she remembered and somehow even more intimidating. 5 years ago, Ethan had been ambitious, charming, and endlessly warm whenever he looked at her. Now there was something colder in his expression, something carefully controlled behind those familiar green eyes that once made her feel safe. But the moment he looked directly at her, she saw crack for half a second. Shock, regret, maybe even guilt. Emily forced herself to look away first. "I want another doctor," she whispered through uneven breaths. One of the nurses hesitated before glancing toward Ethan nervously. Everyone in Chicago knew who he was. Not just because he had become one of the country's most respected surgeons, but because his name was attached to one of the largest private medical corporations in America. Ethan Brooks was the face of magazine covers, billion-dollar healthcare conferences, and national interviews. Yet somehow he was standing here in the middle of the night looking at her like the past had just walked back into his life without warning. Ethan kept his tone calm. "There is no time to transfer you. I said I do not want you here." Another contraction hit before she could say more, forcing her to grip the sheets tightly as pain spread through her stomach again. Ethan immediately stepped closer while a nurse adjusted the monitors beside her. "Emily, listen to me," he said carefully. "Your blood pressure is unstable. Stress is making this worse." Hearing him say her name after all these years felt almost unreal. She remembered that voice whispering against her hair in their tiny apartment back when Ethan was still in medical school, working impossible hours while dreaming about changing the world someday. Back then he used to eat cheap takeout with her at 2 in the morning while studying anatomy textbooks at their kitchen table. He used to kiss her forehead before every overnight shift and promise her that one day he would give her a better life. Then one day he disappeared. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. Emily swallowed hard as tears gathered in her eyes. "You do not get to act like you care now." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. The silence between them became heavy enough to suffocate the room. One of the younger nurses quietly stepped backward, clearly sensing the tension. Outside, thunder rumbled across the city again while rain streaked against the dark hospital windows. Emily turned her face away from him, trying to focus on breathing instead of the memories crashing through her mind. She remembered sitting alone in her apartment years ago staring at her phone for hours waiting for Ethan to answer. She remembered learning she was pregnant only 3 weeks after he vanished. Most of all, she remembered realizing she had been abandoned by the one person she trusted completely. "Dr. Brooks," a nurse interrupted softly. "We need to discuss possible complications." Ethan nodded once before stepping toward the monitor. His expression shifted instantly back into professional focus, but Emily noticed how his hands paused briefly when he reached for her chart. Then his eyes moved lower, directly to the bracelet around her wrist. "Emily Carter. Emergency admission." And beneath it, the baby's information already prepared by the nurses earlier that night. "Baby boy Carter Brooks." Ethan stopped breathing. The entire room seemed to freeze around him as his eyes locked onto that last name. Slowly, almost like he was afraid of the answer, Ethan looked back up at Emily while disbelief spread across his face. And for the first time since entering the room, the powerful billionaire doctor looked completely shaken. For a moment, Ethan Brooks looked less like one of the most powerful doctors in America, and more like a man who had just watched his entire world stop moving. His eyes remained fixed on the bracelet around Emily's wrist, while the steady beeping of the monitors filled the silence between them. Emily saw the exact second the truth hit him. The baby was his. She wanted to feel satisfaction after all these years. She wanted him to hurt the way she had hurt. But seeing the color drain from his face only made the ache inside her chest worse. Ethan slowly lifted his gaze toward her. "Emily." His voice sounded unsteady now, completely different from the calm billionaire doctor the world admired on television interviews. Emily looked away immediately. "Do not." Another contraction tightened across her stomach, forcing her to inhale sharply, while the nurses adjusted equipment around her bed. Ethan moved instinctively toward her side, but Emily flinched before he could touch her hand. The reaction hit him harder than she expected. He stepped back. Instantly. "You should have told me," he said quietly. Emily let out a bitter laugh despite the pain. "Told you." Tears burned in her eyes again. "You disappeared." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but one of the nurses interrupted nervously. "Dr. Brooks, we need approval for additional monitoring. Her blood pressure is climbing again." Ethan nodded automatically without taking his eyes off Emily. "Do whatever is necessary." The nurse hurried away while another contraction forced Emily to close her eyes tightly. She hated how vulnerable she felt lying there in front of him. 5 years ago she would have trusted Ethan with every part of her life. Now she did not even trust herself to look at him too long without remembering who they used to be. Ethan remained silent beside her bed for several seconds before speaking again, more carefully this time. "How old is he supposed to be?" Emily swallowed hard. "You already know the answer." Ethan looked down briefly, his jaw tightening. 5 years. 5 entire years. The realization settled visibly across his face like something heavy pressing against his chest. Emily remembered when Ethan still lived in a tiny apartment near Northwestern University, while balancing medical school and part-time shifts at the hospital. Back then he used to fall asleep with textbooks on his chest while she worked late at the diner to help pay rent. They were broke, exhausted, and completely in love. None of it had mattered because they had each other. Then Ethan's life changed almost overnight. A private healthcare investor discovered one of his research projects during residency, and suddenly powerful people began surrounding him. Wealthy investors, elite surgeons, national opportunities. The farther Ethan climbed into that world, the more distant everything started to feel. And then one day he vanished completely. No warning, no explanation. Emily had spent years convincing herself she hated him. But hearing his voice tonight had reopened wounds she thought were buried forever. Ethan finally spoke again, quieter this time. "I searched for you." Emily stared at him in disbelief before anger quickly replaced it. "Do not lie to me." "I am not lying." His voice carried something raw now, something she had never heard from him before. "You were gone when I came back." Emily frowned through the pain. "What are you talking about?" Before Ethan could answer, another doctor entered the room carrying test results. The older physician walked directly toward Ethan with visible urgency. "There is a problem." Ethan immediately turned serious again. "What kind of problem?" The doctor lowered his voice, but Emily still caught enough to feel fear spread through her stomach. "The baby's heart rate is dropping during contractions." The room suddenly felt colder. Emily's breathing became uneven as panic rushed through her chest. Ethan looked at the monitor, then back at her, and for the first time that night she saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear for himself, fear of losing her. The fear in Ethan Brooks's eyes unsettled Emily more than the pain tearing through her body. For years she had imagined confronting him someday. Imagined finally telling him how badly he had destroyed her life when he disappeared without a word. But she had never imagined seeing him look terrified. Ethan turned sharply toward the monitors while nurses moved faster around the room. The steady rhythm of the baby's heartbeat had started dipping lower during each contraction, and even Emily could hear the difference now. "How long has this been happening?" Ethan asked the older physician beside him. "Only during the last several minutes," the doctor answered quietly. "But the drops are becoming more frequent." Ethan ran a hand through his damp dark hair before forcing himself back into complete focus. The billionaire businessman vanished instantly. Now he looked only like a surgeon under pressure. Calm, precise, dangerous in the way highly skilled people became when something mattered to them personally. Emily watched him study every monitor in the room while nurses updated charts around him. Even after all these years, she remembered how Ethan used to become completely absorbed when solving a problem. Back in college, he once spent 16 straight hours helping her repair an old car engine because she could not afford another vehicle. He had always been relentless when someone he loved was in trouble. The memory hurt more than she expected. "Emily." Ethan's voice softened slightly as he stepped closer again. "I need you to stay calm for me. Do not say that like you still know me." Ethan looked at her for a long second before answering quietly. "I never stopped knowing you." Emily's chest tightened painfully. She wanted to stay angry. It had taken years to build those walls inside herself after Ethan vanished. Years of working double shifts. Years of hiding pregnancy fears alone. Years of raising a child she thought would never know his father. But hearing him speak like this was dangerous because part of her still remembered the man he used to be before fame and power changed everything. Another contraction hit hard enough to steal her breath for a moment. Ethan instinctively reached toward her again, stopping himself only inches from her hand. Emily noticed the hesitation immediately. He was afraid she would pull away again. Somehow that hurt him. "Why now?" she whispered once the pain eased slightly. "Why pretend any of this matters?" Ethan stared at her silently before answering. "Because it always mattered." Emily shook her head weakly. "You disappeared for 5 years. I came back for you." Her eyes narrowed instantly. "Stop saying that." Ethan lowered his voice further. "The day I left Chicago, my father suffered a stroke in Boston. His attorneys contacted me on the flight. By the time I returned 3 days later, your apartment was empty." Emily frowned in confusion. "That is impossible. I went back every week for months." His voice carried exhaustion now, like he had repeated these memories too many times alone. The landlord told me you moved out suddenly. Your phone number was disconnected. Every email I sent bounced back. Emily stared at him, stunned despite herself. I never changed my email. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. Then someone made sure I could not reach you. Before Emily could process the meaning behind those words, another nurse rushed into the room carrying updated charts. Dr. Brooks, her blood pressure is climbing again. Ethan immediately took the chart, scanning it quickly while tension sharpened across his face. Prepare operating room 3 just in case. Emily's heart skipped. What does that mean? Ethan looked at her carefully, and suddenly she realized he was choosing his words very carefully not to frighten her. It means I am not taking any chances with you or the baby. Outside, the storm continued pounding against the hospital windows, but inside the room the atmosphere had changed completely. Emily could feel it in the hurried footsteps, the hushed voices, the worried glances between nurses. Something was wrong. Ethan handed the chart back before stepping toward the doorway. Then he paused and looked back at her one more time. Emily, he said quietly, almost like a confession, I spent 5 years trying to find you. And before she could respond, a loud alarm suddenly erupted from the monitor beside her bed. The sharp alarm slicing through the room instantly changed everything. Nurses rushed toward the monitor while Emily's heart slammed against her chest in panic. The baby's heartbeat had dropped again, lower this time, and the worried expression spreading across the staff made her stomach twist with fear. What is happening? Emily asked breathlessly as another contraction tightened painfully through her body. No one answered her immediately. Ethan stepped beside the monitor, studying the numbers with intense focus while one nurse adjusted the sensors against Emily's stomach. The room that had already felt tense moments ago now felt dangerously quiet except for the alarms and the pounding storm outside. Dr. Brooks, the older physician said carefully, we may need to move faster than expected. Ethan nodded once, his face unreadable now. Prep the operating room immediately. Emily's eyes widened. No, Ethan turned toward her quickly. Emily, listen to me. No surgery, she whispered shakily. Please. Fear wrapped tightly around every word. She had spent months preparing herself mentally for tonight, but nothing about this felt normal anymore. The nurses moved too fast. The doctors exchanged too many quiet looks. And Ethan looked far too afraid for someone who was supposed to stay calm under pressure. Ethan crouched slightly beside her bed so she would not have to strain her neck to see him. His voice dropped lower, softer than before. I need you to trust me. Emily almost laughed hearing those words from him. Trust. After disappearing for 5 years, after leaving her to survive pregnancy alone, now he wanted trust. But when she looked into his eyes, she did not see arrogance or distance. She saw desperation. Real desperation. The baby's heart rate keeps dropping during contractions, Ethan explained carefully. I do not want to risk waiting too long. Emily's breathing became uneven as tears filled her eyes again. Is my baby going to be okay? Ethan answered immediately without hesitation. I am going to do everything possible to make sure both of you are safe. Both of you. The words hit her harder than she expected. Ethan kept saying things like he already belonged to them somehow. Another wave of pain forced Emily to grip the sheets tightly while nurses prepared medications nearby. Ethan instinctively reached for her hand again. This time, in the middle of fear and exhaustion and confusion, Emily did not pull away. The moment their hands touched, Ethan froze briefly, like the contact itself hurt him emotionally. His thumb pressed gently against her trembling fingers while he steadied his voice. Stay with me, okay? Emily stared at him silently. She remembered that same hand holding hers years ago, while they walked along Lake Michigan during winter nights when they had no money for restaurants or vacations. Ethan used to tell her they would build a future together someday no matter how hard life became. Back then she believed him completely. Suddenly the doors opened again as another doctor entered carrying additional scans. Dr. Brooks, there is another concern. Ethan released Emily's hand slowly before taking the file. His expression darkened almost instantly as he reviewed the information. How long ago did these symptoms begin? Possibly several hours before admission. Emily watched the tension spread visibly across Ethan's face while he looked back at her. It was the expression of a man calculating risks faster than anyone else in the room. "Tell me what is wrong," Emily demanded softly. Ethan hesitated. That hesitation frightened her more than anything. Finally, he answered in a controlled voice that sounded almost too calm. "There are signs your body is under more stress than we initially thought." "What does that mean?" Ethan looked directly into her eyes before speaking. "It means I may have to make difficult decisions very quickly tonight." Outside, the thunder shook the hospital windows again while nurses rushed to prepare the operating room down the hall. And standing in the center of the chaos, Ethan Brooks suddenly looked less like a billionaire surgeon and more like a man terrified of losing the only woman he had never stopped loving. Everything inside the labor room began moving faster after Ethan gave the order to prepare the operating room. Nurses rushed through the hall carrying equipment, while another physician updated charts near the monitors. The storm outside had intensified so badly that thunder now rattled the glass windows every few minutes, casting brief flashes of white light across the walls. Emily tried to focus on breathing, but fear kept tightening around her chest every time the baby's heartbeat dipped on the monitor beside her bed. Ethan remained near her side, speaking rapidly with the medical team while still watching her closely between every instruction. "I want neonatal specialists standing by," he ordered firmly. "And call Dr. Matthews at Northwestern Memorial right now." One of the nurses looked surprised. "Dr. Matthews is not even on shift tonight." "I know," Ethan answered immediately. "Get him anyway." Emily stared at him weakly through another contraction. She had seen Ethan determined before, but never like this. The calm billionaire image the world admired had completely disappeared. This was personal for him. Deeply personal. One of the administrators hurried into the room carrying a tablet. "Dr. Brooks, the board is requesting authorization before bringing in outside specialists during weather restrictions." Ethan did not even look up from the monitor. "Approved. There are financial concerns regarding emergency transport and—" "I said approved." His voice cut through the room with enough authority to silence everyone instantly. The administrator hesitated before lowering his voice. "The helicopter team is grounded because of the storm." Ethan finally turned toward him, and Emily saw something dangerous flash behind his eyes. "Then clear the roof manually and bring them in anyway." "Sir, the risk assessment team already denied. I own this hospital." The room went completely silent. Even the nurses stopped moving for a second. Ethan stepped closer to the administrator, his voice low and controlled now, which somehow felt even more intense. "If there is even a 1% chance those specialists help save her or my son, then every resource this hospital has belongs to them tonight. Do you understand me?" The administrator nodded immediately before rushing out of the room. Emily stared at Ethan in disbelief. 5 years ago, he had been a medical resident borrowing old textbooks because he could not afford new ones. Now entire hospital systems moved when he spoke. But despite all his power, she could still see fear underneath it. Ethan looked back toward her moments later, and his expression softened instantly. "How are you feeling?" Emily swallowed hard. "Scared." Ethan stepped closer again, lowering his voice enough that only she could hear him. "I know." Another contraction hit, stronger than before, and Emily squeezed her eyes shut while pain rushed through her body. Ethan immediately took her hand again without thinking. This time she held onto him tightly, not because she had forgiven him, not because the past stopped hurting, but because in that terrifying moment he was the only thing in the room making her feel less alone. Ethan leaned closer carefully. "Listen to me, Emily." His thumb brushed gently across her trembling hand. "You are going to get through this." She looked at him through tears. "You cannot promise that." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I can promise I will not let you face it alone." The word struck something deep inside her chest before she could stop herself from feeling it. Then suddenly another alarm sounded from the monitor. Sharper this time. More urgent. A nurse looked up immediately. "Dr. Brooks, the baby's heart rate dropped again." Ethan's face hardened instantly as he turned toward the screen. The older physician beside him spoke quickly. "We cannot wait much longer." Ethan stared at the monitor for 1/10 second before making the decision. "Move her now." Nurses immediately unlocked the bed while Emily's pulse skyrocketed with panic. "Ethan." His eyes met hers instantly. "I need you to trust me one more time." As the bed began rushing toward the operating room through the bright hospital corridor, Emily noticed something she never expected to see from Ethan Brooks. His hands were shaking. The bright hospital lights blurred above Emily as nurses rushed her bed down the corridor toward the operating room. The wheels rattled across the polished floor while voices echoed around her in hurried fragments she could barely process. Her body felt exhausted, her breathing uneven, and through all the fear and confusion there was only one thing she could focus on. Ethan had not let go of her hand. Even while giving rapid medical instructions to the staff surrounding them, his fingers remained tightly wrapped around hers like he was terrified she might disappear again. "Heart rate still unstable," one nurse called out while checking the monitor beside the bed. "Operating room is ready." Emily turned her head weakly toward Ethan as they entered the large surgical suite filled with bright white light and moving shadows. Everything felt cold and overwhelming. Machines beeped steadily while doctors prepared equipment around her. Ethan finally released her hand only long enough to pull on surgical gloves as another physician approached him near the monitors. "The weather delayed the specialist team," the physician said quietly. "They are still 20 minutes out." Ethan's expression darkened immediately. "We may not have 20 minutes. Emily watched him move across the room with complete focus, issuing orders calmly even while tension filled every movement he made. It was strange seeing the two versions of Ethan at once. The brilliant surgeon the world respected and the man whose hands had shaken. While holding hers in the hallway moments earlier, one of the nurses leaned closer to Emily gently. "You are doing great." Emily nodded weakly, though fear still twisted through her chest. She had spent years preparing herself to raise this baby alone. She had imagined birthdays, first steps, school mornings, bedtime stories. She had imagined protecting her son from ever feeling abandoned the way she once had. But now everything felt uncertain. Ethan stepped back beside her bed again. His voice softened instantly the moment he looked at her. "Emily, I need you to stay with me." "I am trying," she whispered. Ethan carefully brushed damp strands of hair away from her forehead, the gesture so familiar it nearly broke her heart. "Look at me." She did. And for the first time that night, she saw tears gathering in his eyes. Ethan Brooks never looked emotional in public. The media called him cold, controlled, impossible to read. Yet standing beside her now, he looked like a man barely holding himself together. "I should have found you sooner," he whispered. Emily stared at him silently, too exhausted to answer. Before Ethan could say more, the operating room doors suddenly opened again. A tall woman in a dark coat hurried inside carrying a folder tightly against her chest. The second Ethan saw her, his face changed instantly. "Claire." Emily frowned weakly, confused. The woman stopped near Ethan, clearly shaken after rushing through the storm. "I came as soon as I heard." Ethan looked tense immediately. Now is not the time. But Claire glanced toward Emily with guilt already written across her face. She deserves to know the truth. Emily's pulse quickened slightly. What truth? Ethan closed his eyes briefly like he already knew what was coming next. Claire looked directly at Emily before speaking carefully. 5 years ago, Ethan did not leave you willingly. Emily's stomach tightened. What are you talking about? Claire swallowed hard. His father found out about your pregnancy before Ethan did. The room suddenly felt silent except for the steady beeping of the monitors. Ethan looked away while Claire continued quietly. The Brooks family controlled everything around him back then. His emails, his finances, even his apartment access. They believed you would destroy his future before his company launched. Emily stared at Ethan in disbelief as pieces of the past began crashing together inside her mind. No, Claire nodded slowly, tears filling her own eyes now. Your phone calls were blocked. Your messages were deleted. And when Ethan came back for you, she paused painfully before finishing the sentence. His father made sure you were already gone. Emily looked at Ethan again, and the pain in his eyes told her something terrifying. He had been telling the truth all along. Emily felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. The bright surgical lights above her blurred as Claire's words repeated over and over inside her mind. Ethan had not abandoned her. He had tried to come back. For 5 years she had built her entire life around the belief that he chose ambition over love, wealth over family, success over her. But now, lying in the operating room while machines beeped around her, she realized someone else had destroyed them long before either of them understood what was happening. Ethan stood silently beside her bed, unable to meet her eyes for several seconds. The controlled billionaire image he carried in public was gone completely now. He looked exhausted, broken even. "Why did you never tell me?" Emily whispered finally. Ethan swallowed hard before answering. "Because every time I got close to finding you, something happened." His voice sounded rough with emotion now. "By the time I rebuilt the company and finally separated myself from my father's control, you were gone again." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "I stayed in Chicago for almost 2 years. Pain crossed Ethan's face immediately. "I know." The room grew quiet except for the storm outside and the monitors beside her bed. Claire stepped closer carefully. "His father paid people to keep information from him. He was terrified Ethan would walk away from the company if he chose you." Emily felt tears sliding down her cheeks now, not from fear this time, but from the crushing weight of lost years. Years Ethan could have spent watching his son grow. Years she spent believing she was unwanted. Ethan finally looked directly at her again. "I searched every hospital record in Illinois after I realized you were pregnant." Emily's breathing caught softly. "What?" "I knew you would never leave without a reason." His voice cracked slightly for the first time all night. "I knew something was wrong." Before Emily could respond, another sharp alarm sounded from the monitor. Nurses moved quickly again while the older physician stepped toward Ethan urgently. "Dr. Brooks, we are losing time." Ethan looked at the readings, and Emily saw the fear return instantly to his face. The physician lowered his voice. "The safest option now requires immediate authorization." Ethan glanced briefly toward Emily before answering. "Do it." But the physician hesitated. "There is another issue." Ethan's expression hardened. "What issue?" The physician handed him a document quietly. "The specialized procedure is not covered under the hospital approval system, without board authorization. The equipment arrived during the storm, but legally we cannot proceed unless ownership signs off on the liability release." Ethan scanned the document for only a second before grabbing a pen immediately. But another administrator entered quickly behind them. "Dr. Brooks, the board already refused emergency authorization." Ethan looked up slowly. "Excuse me. The legal team says the financial risk is too high during current weather conditions." Emily watched something cold settle into Ethan's expression. "There is no alternative procedure available in time? Not one with these survival odds." The room fell silent. Then Ethan did something nobody expected. Without hesitation, he pulled another document from the administrator's folder and signed it instantly. The administrator's eyes widened. "Dr. Brooks, this transfers your controlling shares." "I know exactly what it does." Emily frowned weakly from the bed. "Ethan, what are they talking about?" But Ethan never looked away from the paperwork while he signed the final page. The billionaire founder of one of America's largest medical companies had just given up majority control of his empire in exchange for immediate authorization to save her life. Claire covered her mouth in shock while the administrator stared speechlessly at the signature. Ethan handed the papers back calmly before finally looking at Emily again. His voice softened immediately despite everything happening around them. "None of it matters more than you." Emily felt tears spill freely down her face now as nurses rushed to prepare the equipment around her. For the first time in 5 years, she finally understood something that changed everything. Ethan Brooks had never stopped loving her, and he was willing to lose everything to prove it. 3 weeks later, the storm that nearly changed everything had become nothing more than a distant memory outside the large hospital windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Morning sunlight spilled softly across the private recovery suite, while the city moved peacefully below. For the first time in years, Emily Carter felt something unfamiliar inside her chest. Peace. She sat quietly in the hospital bed, wrapped in a light blanket, watching the tiny newborn sleeping peacefully in her arms. His small fingers curled gently against the fabric near her shoulder while soft afternoon light touched his pale blonde hair. Doctors called him perfectly healthy now. Every frightening complication from that night had faded one by one over the following days. But what Emily still struggled to understand was Ethan. Ever since the surgery, he had barely left the hospital. Nurses whispered constantly about the billionaire doctor who gave away control of his own company without hesitation. News outlets had exploded with rumors after emergency board changes suddenly became public. Yet Ethan ignored all of it completely. The only thing he seemed to care about was sitting beside Emily and their son every single day. The soft sound of the suite door opening pulled Emily from her thoughts. Ethan stepped quietly into the room carrying a paper coffee cup in one hand and a small blue stuffed elephant in the other. He paused the second he saw the baby asleep against her chest, and something warm softened across his face immediately. Emily noticed it every time he looked at their son. That expression. Like he still could not believe any of this was real. Ethan set the coffee down carefully before walking closer. Did he finally fall asleep? Emily smiled faintly. About 10 minutes ago. Ethan nodded quietly and sat beside her bed. For a moment neither of them spoke. They simply looked at the tiny baby sleeping peacefully between them while sunlight filled the room. It felt strangely natural, like a life both of them should have had years ago. Ethan finally looked toward Emily. How are you feeling today? Better. She hesitated briefly before adding softly, the doctor said I can go home tomorrow. Something unreadable crossed Ethan's expression for a second before he nodded. That is good. Emily studied him carefully. Even now he still looked exhausted beneath the polished appearance the world expected from him. But there was something lighter about him too. Something she had never seen before. Like losing control of the company had somehow freed him from carrying a weight he hated for years. Claire told me your father is furious. Ethan gave a quiet laugh without humor. That is probably an understatement. Emily lowered her eyes toward the baby. You really gave up everything for us. Ethan leaned back slightly, watching his son sleep. No, his voice softened. I gave up something that stopped mattering a long time ago. Emily felt emotion tighten in her chest again. 5 years of anger did not disappear overnight. Neither did pain. But every wall she built around her heart had started cracking the moment she realized Ethan never abandoned her willingly. He had been fighting for them in ways she never saw. Ethan slowly reached out toward the baby, hesitating slightly like he was afraid to disturb him. Can I? Emily looked at him for a long moment before carefully placing their son into his arms. Ethan held the baby with unbelievable gentleness, like he was holding something sacred. The powerful surgeon who commanded entire hospitals suddenly looked completely different sitting there quietly cradling his son against his chest. His eyes glistened slightly as the baby wrapped tiny fingers around one of his. Ethan let out a shaky breath and looked down at him in complete silence. Emily realized then that this was the first time Ethan had ever held his child. 5 years of loss. 5 years of searching. 5 years of loving them from a distance without knowing where they were. And now he finally had them in his arms. Ethan looked back toward Emily, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I lost both of you forever. Emily felt tears rise in her eyes again as she watched the man she once believed had abandoned her completely. But the truth was far more heartbreaking than she ever imagined. The man she spent years trying to forget had spent those same years trying to find his way back to her.